Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're fortunate to have Kendra McSweeney, who is the professor of geography at Ohio State University. Kendra, thanks so much for coming today.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Mike. Great to be here.
You know, as I've discussed with many others, I'm going to ask you to reflect upon your life, really, and to provide us just with a brief story, really, about your childhood and then going on to through undergraduate studies and graduate work, and what really inspired you as you reflect upon this to consider geography as a field of study that you'd want to pursue. Would you care to share some time with us about that?
Sure. I have thought a fair bit about this because, as you know, a lot of our students here in the U.S. Kind of have an epiphany when they finally get into a geography classroom, and they're like, "Wow, I love this. How did I not know I love geography so much?" That did not happen with me. I grew up in Canada and spent 2 years in elementary and high school in the UK, and in both.
Where in the UK?
In the first time, I was in Kenilworth in Warwickshire, and the second time in Oxford, just in both cases in regular public schools. And in both Canada, I grew up in Ontario, in Kingston, Ontario, and then we moved to Montreal. So in both the Anglophone and Francophone systems in Canada and in the UK, geography is built into the curriculum in elementary and high school. So there was none of this, what is geography? Wow, I was pretty sure I was interested in it. But when it came to, and I really enjoyed it in high school. I remember I had a high school geography teacher who had grown up in Newfoundland, and he talked about how the cod fishermen used to throw away the lobster that they would pull up. And it was only him and the other poor kids who had to go to school with lobster sandwiches. And I remember that sort of thing made me interested about the world and how different people experience the world. I remember in England, we had a geography text that had pictures of Canada, and the photos were mislabeled in the text. There was a picture of the Rocky Mountains, and it said something like, the Appalachian Mountains. And I remember, early geography nerd that I was at 13, going up to the teacher and saying, "I believe the textbook is incorrect." You can imagine, you can imagine that did not endear me to the teacher or to my fellow students, but whatever. Anyway, so when I got to, the system is a little different in Quebec, but when I got to the stage before deciding what I wanted to major in at McGill University, I knew I was really interested in the natural sciences and in ecology. And I was really interested in people too. And I was thinking, should I major in ecology or in anthropology? And I had worked at that point for 2 summers. I was about to work for a 3rd summer as a naturalist, like a nature guide in in forests on the West Island of Montreal, and then later in Northern Ontario. And what I had learned from doing that is that the forests were really, you couldn't understand the forests looking at them only as an ecologist, because they had been profoundly transformed by people. That's very obvious in Europe, but it's also very obvious in long settled parts of North America, forests that still show the imprint of indigenous management going back to the 1500s, before the 1500s. And so when I looked at the course catalog for geography at McGill, I saw that here was a discipline that was bringing together the human and the human and the physical, the natural sciences and the human sciences, in a way that really suited how I was seeing the world at that time. So I have worked ever since, 40 years on or 35 years on, I'm still working at the human environment interface in geography.
And there you go. So at McGill, were there any particular professors that inspired you to continue your studies?
Yeah, I felt pretty early on that I was in the right place in my first classes, because the other students in my classes had the same interests that I did, and we formed a really tight cohort. I'm in touch with many of them still, and I knew that these were the people I wanted to be around. And the professors at first were kind of incidental. I know that probably no professor wants to hear that, but in the later years of undergrad, as we started doing more research and working more closely with professors, that's when they really made a difference. And Theo Hills is he's passed away, but he was a geographer there who had worked for many years in the Guyanas of northern South America.
Mm-hmm.
And he led a field course to Barbados. So we went to a bunch of geographers. He would take a bunch of geography students down every year to do a field course
It's
in Barbados.
fascinating.
Yeah.
A wonderful opportunity.
Oh, it was great. And he really was the mastermind of the course. And what he introduced us to was really looking at landscapes with the eyes of a geographer, talking to people and looking at and measuring. I think we had an exercise where we went and interviewed people and mapped their house gardens. So we looked at the diversity of plants that they were growing in their gardens and
their house gardens.
Yeah, I love that. I love talking to people about
Clarissa Kimber did some great work on that.
Yeah, in fact, we read her work. So I was really inspired, and this is what Dr. Theo Hills opened our eyes to, was all the work in kind of the Sowarian tradition of human-environment interaction, people shaping landscapes, cultural landscapes. And he gave us the tools to not just read about that, but to do it, to do the field work associated with that, which frankly is the most fun.
That's great. And so from McGill, which really had a very rich history in geography, a lot of climatology, but still, I mean, a strong physical tradition.
Yes.
But then you went to beautiful downtown Knoxville, I guess, huh?
That's right, Knox Vegas. Well, the physical geography tradition at McGill was really focused on, when I was there, on soil science and to some extent biogeography, and I got really interested in those elements of physical geography. So at that point, I'd only done 3 years of undergrad because that's all that's required for Quebecois students. And I was ready to I wasn't ready to be done with school yet. So I thought, and some of my colleagues felt the same way, it was either we take a gap year and travel the world, or we do grad school and travel at the same time. So I ordered, this was pre-internet, so I ordered the brochures from all the American universities that were as far away and as tropical as I could get from Canada. that included most of the schools in the Southeast, and including UT Knoxville. And Dr. Sally Horn reached out and said, we'd like to offer you a funding package. So sight unseen and without a car and without ever having lived in the United States, I headed down there and had a wonderful experience learning from her and Lydia Pulsifer and Ron Foresta about really getting much more into biogeography, cultural geography, and I think that's sort of where my master's in science was really focused. And I did my field work in Central America. I didn't speak Spanish at the time, so I went down to Belize and did research on basically how humans had profoundly shaped the distribution of this one very common palm tree.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great experience.
That's wonderful. And then you returned to McGill.
Yeah, well, at that point, I did not want to continue to stay in school, so I didn't return to Montreal right away. And in fact, I was really not convinced I wanted to do a PhD. In fact, I was very convinced that if I did, I would be overqualified for the things I wanted to do. So I took, I was accepted into an internship position at the National Geographic Society.
Mm-hmm.
So I went up to DC and did that for for 4 months, and being in DC was great. It was really fun. It was great to work. Once the internship was over, I worked in a juice bar, and really, it was great to not be on an academic schedule.
And at National Geographic, was Barry Bishop still around then?
Um, I can't remember.
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
okay.
I for sure remember his name, but I don't know if I met him or not. I also have a terrible memory for certain things. So he
Don't
may
grow
well
old.
have been
It's a
in.
nuisance.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's no shock to anyone that internships, the jobs themselves can be kind of boring. And my job was to verify. Again, pre-internet, we needed to verify that every question in the National Geography Bee had the correct answer. So I had to go, for every question, I had to photocopy 3 different atlases to show with evidence that a question was correct, just in case there was some dispute about the correct. And just to give you a sense of how little the geography bee is related to real geographic knowledge, I don't remember a single thing I learned from doing all that research, because it was, it's the ultimate trivialization of geographic knowledge, kind of taking people and place out of context and just kind of quizzing people. And I know that was a frustration of the bee at the time, because all the kids who were winning the bee were going on to medical school and law school and not becoming geographers, because what they proved they were good at through the geography bee was memorization of facts. Not, I mean, I don't mean to say they weren't interested in geography, but they weren't being rewarded for asking the sorts of questions that geographers ask. They were being rewarded for memorizing facts about maps.
That's a really interesting perspective that I think needs to be elaborated on, because the geography bee and these kinds of tests, if you will, that assess individuals do very little to enhance the standing of geography. Right. With regard to giving us credit as geographers for the talents we have in analyzing landscapes and making sense out of the why of where. But you're right. How many winners of a geography bee go on to study geography? I don't know, but it doesn't seem like many.
No, the data back then was that it was a tiny fraction, and so. If the goal of the geography education program at National Geographic, which sponsored the bee, was to enhance geographic education, the bee was getting all the attention, but it wasn't really generating an interest in geography. Other things that, like the Geographic Alliances and the other programs that National Geographic had, were making a difference, but the bee was not one of them. But anyway, while I was in the basement of National Geographic in their library photocopying these atlases, I saw an ad. There was like a bulletin board, and I saw an ad for a job. The Harvard Institute for International Development was looking for people who would be willing to go and live in the rainforests of eastern Honduras, eastern Honduras, the Mosquitia region, and collect data for them. And so I applied for the job and ultimately got it. And so the next year, so still not going back to university, but just as an employee of the Harvard Institute for International Development, I was hired basically onto an NSF project to collect data for, the contract was for 30 months. I didn't last that long. I only lasted 22 months in a very small village of the Tawaka people in eastern Honduras, a village of about 500 people. So I lived there for 22 months and collected data on all the ways in which they used the forest and the ways in which the forest was fundamentally part of their lives. And that was a life-changing experience. That was wonderful.
Well, and you completed a doctoral dissertation or thesis, I guess, in Canada on the subject at McGill later.
Right. So after the 22 months there, I think I only left once in that time. So I was really, I was living a pretty culturally isolated existence. I did not speak English for probably about 10 months at a time. And so by the end of that time, I had learned quite a bit of Mosquito. I spoke Spanish, and I was very, very desperate for like fresh vegetables and my friends. So I still wasn't convinced that a PhD was what I wanted to do, but I wanted to get back to Montreal. And so I thought, well, why don't I apply for a PhD at McGill? And while I'm doing the PhD, I'll figure out what I really want to do. and I joked.
Why not?
Yeah, right. I was like, why don't I just find out? Because I wasn't sure I wanted to be an academic, and I always considered it kind of my plan B. And so during the PhD, I ended up going back to Eastern Honduras, and I did end up writing my dissertation on research I did there subsequently. And of course, that process was made much easier by the fact that I had already lived there and I knew everybody, and they were willing to help me do my research, and I already had.
So you really did considerable field work, really, before you even entered the doctoral program.
That's right. That's right, and that helped me tremendously during the doctoral process, because I was able then to just go down for 6 months for my PhD, and I ended up getting a lot of data that I just couldn't have parachuted in 6 months and done what I did. I had to have that foundation of having lived there. Yeah, and it was, I mean, I did end up doing during my PhD, because of the demands in Canada for coursework are so much less than in the US. Basically, I took 2 seminars, because by that point I'd had a lot of geography coursework, and basically they were like, do your dissertation and take 2 seminars. So in 4 years, that gave me time to explore other things too. So for example, I wrote a couple of, I thought I might be interested in like being a freelance magazine writer. So I tried that. I wrote a couple of, for like a Canadian Discovery magazine, kind of like the Canadian National Geographic, and like took photos and wrote a feature, and that was a great experience. And it told me that I liked doing it, but I wouldn't want to do it full time. And then I did, was interested in, I thought maybe I want to do a career in development. So before and after Hurricane Mitch, I helped the Tuaca people write grants and do a lot of kind of humanitarian aid and recovery and kind of longer term fundraising for more longer term development projects. And I found that process really interesting, but I thought, for me, I don't want to do this full time. And then I taught a class, and I was like, this is fine. I wouldn't want to do it full time.
And where did you teach the class? At McGill?
I taught one at McGill, and I taught one at Concordia University, also at McGill. So doing the PhD allowed me to explore these different professionalization avenues, and it slowly dawned on me, and you'd think it would have occurred to me sooner, but it kind of dawned on me that if I go into academia, I can continue to do all these things, none of them full-time, all of them part-time, but as a full-time academic. And in other words, academia is such a broad umbrella. There's many things we can do under it, and that's kind of what kept me in academia.
Let's talk about your doctoral thesis in the Honduras. Would you elaborate, because it's quite interesting, especially associated with this indigenous group that had such a magnificent presence in historic time, but is merely a parenthesis, I suppose, today. Would you care to elaborate?
Sure. So I lived among the Tuaca people, who at the time numbered about 2,000 people, and about half of them spoke their language, Tuaca, and the rest spoke a mix of either Miskito, which is the regional language of the Miskito Indians who live in the Mosquitia, and the rest spoke Spanish. And they were embarked at that time on a real push for to reestablish their territories and reestablish their cultural heritage, because they had lost a lot of land when they lost a lot of people during many episodes of pandemics smallpox epidemics that they had faced since the early contact years. They've been enslaved by the mosquito and other people. So they were a very kind of downtrodden and very small ethnicity. And I lived with them during a time of real cultural and territorial resurgence when they were very proud to teach their children their language and work with the government to declare the Tawaka Sagni Biosphere Reserve, which allowed them to maintain their territory kind of within the rubric of a protected area. And so it was an exciting time, and my research was really devoted to understanding how, as part of all that cultural and territorial resurgence, kind of what role the forest played in that. Now, it's easy to say Indigenous people live in harmony in the rainforest, but what did that actually mean? And how did that work? And one of the ways that I explored that was to look at their long tradition, and by long I mean probably at least documented over 500 years, their long tradition of making dugout canoes. And a lot of my friends joked about the fact my whole PhD was about dugout canoes and how basic and primitive that was. But in fact, they were a wonderful way to exploring how people turned these magnificent rainforest trees into a really important part of their material culture without any chainsaws or anything, just with very simple tools, and how those canoes were so fundamental to the circulation of commodities, to livelihoods, and were themselves object of barter and trade, really was a wonderful way to explore how they lived and how they were able to not just survive, but kind of thrive within a pretty challenging tropical environment. And they didn't obviously just cut down these trees, they also nurtured the growth of these trees and like their agroforestry systems and stuff like that. So it was not a perfect system, and the levels of poverty and the ways in which the people were underserved with medical and educational care was appalling. But in many ways, they were living lives that were defined by their own goals and in ways that they were proud to call their own ways of life. So it was a very exciting time to be there and a real privilege to be able to be a guest in their communities.
Mm-hmm. And so you completed your doctoral work at McGill. Were there any professors that provided you with really, really rich guidance at McGill that you would care to comment on? Sure.
Well, I owe a lot, obviously, to Oliver Coombs, my dissertation advisor. Again, because of the way that Canadian PhDs happen, I didn't really have, my committee was relatively small. I didn't take courses with any of the other members of my committee. So really Oliver was very instrumental. He in particular told me, you're going to have to learn statistics if you're going to look at the kind of microeconomic dynamics of these people living rural livelihoods. If you want to measure those and understand them, you're going to have to use econometrics. And at first I was intimidated by that because in fact, I think statistics was one of the classes I had failed as an undergrad. And the idea of doing stats was just like, what does stats have to do with, rural livelihoods and doing field work? And I don't want to. But then I got over that, and he was very helpful in showing me how useful statistics could be in revealing patterns, not in revealing the processes that underlie those patterns, but in revealing the patterns and then allowing us to ask questions about the underlying processes. And I've relied on that approach to the present. And so I'm very grateful to Oliver for encouraging me to do the uncomfortable thing and learn stats. And that is, I've been very well served by that my entire career.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is an important story for people to listen to, because there are many students that just are uncomfortable with a particular field like stats and don't understand how it might be relevant to their research. Yet this guidance that you receive proved to be very valuable and really shaped your future research endeavors.
Yes. Yes, and I have a lot of sympathy for students who have a hard time with those abstract concepts, because I'm someone who I really benefit from experiential learning. I think I've told you that all the highlights of my learning have been through doing. And if I have to learn, cartography or statistics or anything else in ways that don't seem relevant to the real world, I have no interest. It seems too abstract. And I struggle. That's how I am. I'm not good with those concepts. So the difference between my undergrad stats course, where nothing was applied, we were given like silly questions like, if you pull one blue sock and one yellow sock out of a drawer, what are the odds that, in the next time you pull a sock out, it'll be the pair? Questions like, I don't care what the odds ratio is here. That's a stupid question. I'm not interested in the answer. Whereas as soon as I had my own data and I had compelling questions I wanted to ask, I understood why I needed stats to help me untangle parts of the stories that those data could tell. So I'm a big fan of experiential learning, and in fact, here in our department, we are trying much harder, especially post-pandemic, to embed much more experiential learning, hands-on, not necessarily out of the classroom, but more out of the classroom stuff, more field trips, more getting out and measuring, more doing, more talking to people, rather than the passive lecture mode, particularly in big undergrad intro level classes.
That's very important. And I guess you teach a fieldwork course, if I'm not mistaken, don't you? Would you care to share some insight concerning how you administer this course? Because it's a course that at one time was very common in geography curricula across the U.S. And it's not quite gone the way of the dodo yet, but it's become rather rare for geography programs to include field courses, especially for undergraduates.
Yeah, I teach a research and professionalization seminar for undergrads, and then I teach the fieldwork class at the grad level, though some undergrads can take it. The reason I started teaching that class is when I came to Ohio State, I was coming from the McGill fieldwork tradition, where, of course, everybody's gone in the summer, everybody's in the field, everybody's doing interviews or field work, or they're in the Arctic measuring, methane emissions from permafrost. And I get to Ohio State, and I didn't really know quite the history of the spatial quantitative, the role that the Ohio State University played in the spatial quantitative revolution. But when I got here, I sort of asked, so I'm going to the field this summer, where's the fieldwork room where all the equipment is? Because I need, this was in the early 2000s, I need like a GPS, I need some other stuff. And people just looked at me and said, what fieldwork room? What field equipment room? We don't have that. Nobody goes into the field here. And I was like, what? And that wasn't entirely true. Some of my my atmospheric science colleagues are huge fieldwork people. But a lot of the human geography and the GIS that have been done here was not fieldwork reliant. And so for someone kind of in the human environment tradition, it was sort of shocking to me that there was so little emphasis on fieldwork. And the students were expected to, if they wanted to incorporate fieldwork, that is generating data about the world firsthand, whether it's, in their backyard or in Antarctica, the assumption was they'd figure it out. And that meant they would figure out not only the mechanics of generating the data, but the process of doing so ethically, doing so replicably and rigorously. And that was a tall order. And it seemed that was unfair to expect students to somehow, especially grad students, to somehow magically figure all that out. So the course is designed really to set students up to think about fieldwork much more intentionally. And I have them do small exercises like, doing some interviewing and doing some field work, doing some landscape interpretation. But really, we just read and learn from what others have written about fieldwork. And that, I think that gives our grad students a firmer foundation from which to decide, first of all, if they want to generate their own data, And by data, I just mean any information about the world. Do they want to go and take photos and measure things and talk to people, or do they want to rely on secondary data?
Hmm.
So it helps them do that. And I have come to think over time, because I've taught that course for many years, that we need an equal amount of attention to so the fieldwork moment in that course gets privileged, the being in the field, wherever that field is. But I think there's this other gap in our curriculum, maybe not in other departments, but certainly here, where we don't scaffold enough the experience of grad students who are coming back from the field. And this goes for undergrads too, who have done fieldwork. They do this exciting thing called fieldwork, and then they come back from the field and are overwhelmed by what they've collected. And we kind of say, just analyze your data. And they look at us and say, but what do you mean by data analysis? And what we mean is read over your field notes, think about them, think about themes, think about coding, look at your, the numerical data you've collected. How does that match what people were telling you? So how do you integrate the qualitative and the quantitative? How do you mix your methods so that you can answer the questions you have in compelling and rich ways? And we kind of leave them stranded and just say, now do that magical thing called data analysis and then start writing. And we tell them to do it as though the writing is separate from the analysis, but of course all of this is blended together. So over time, my fieldwork course has also incorporated a little bit more of the what do you do with the stuff that you get when you're in the field, and how do you think about turning that into this written document that you will have to.
You are so right, because many field courses or field experiences don't have a strong enough follow-up devoted to that reflective component, that
Right.
reflective and analytical component that makes sense of where one has trod.
Yeah. And in my experience, and this has not happened very often, but when it does happen, when a student gets really frustrated and leaves the program, it can often be in that moment of being overwhelmed, coming back from the field and just like, I can't do it. This writing thing is too hard. But it's not really the writing, it's the making sense of, the complexity of the world that you've just encountered in your fieldwork.
And being geographers, we are immersed in those very complex, very complicated bits and pieces of evidence that we have to make sense out of.
Right. And especially if you're a mixed methods researcher, nothing is off the table. That thing someone told you is as relevant as, those measurements you took, and you have to kind of figure out how to analyze what in what order, and it's hard. Yeah, it's not easy, and I don't think we always kind of hold students' hands through that process as much as we might, because it's always hard to integrate the empirical and then think about your data in the context of the literature. So integrating the theoretical and the empirical, that's really hard. It's really hard. I mean, there's no academic I know who doesn't continue to struggle with those processes. That's what makes what we do challenging and fun.
No one said it was easy.
Yeah, that's right.
So, as we talk about field work and research, I'll ask you to consider a particular theme along two tracks. One would be working with colleagues and crafting publications, and engaged in some collaboration with regard to conducting your research, but in particular the work you've done associated with narco trafficking and the impact on forest lands, tropical deforestation of sorts, such as what you've done with Jennifer Devine, who was previously a guest on this program.
Yeah, that's great. Well, for one thing, I would not be who I am as a scholar without the learning that I have done from the colleagues around me. Most immediately, the other geographers in my department, from whom I have learned all kinds of stuff, and especially because I didn't do a lot of seminars. I didn't do a lot of deep reading as a grad student in kind of multiple parts of geography. I stayed very focused in my area. when I came to Ohio State, I was kind of blown away by the breadth of the field and all the sub-disciplines that I had not necessarily been as aware of as maybe a student in coming out of a US PhD program might have been. Anyway, and so I learned a lot, and I've learned a lot from my colleagues. So the academic enterprise for me has always been kind of a team effort, and I think that's very obvious in the work that I've done on the links between drug policy and drug trafficking and land use and change and livelihoods change in Central America. So that process began when I went down with two OSU students, an undergrad and a grad student, Zoe Pearson and Sarah Santiago. I went down with them in 2011 to the Tawaka communities that I knew really well, and I was expecting to do some follow-up work on how resilient they were and how they were resisting the building of this hydroelectric dam that would have transformed the river they lived on. And what we found was really astonishing to me because it showed, we discovered a landscape that was being absolutely trashed. The forest where they made the dugout canoes was just, it was being cut down at just an unfathomable rate. And everybody told us that it was narco traffickers that were doing that. And that was the beginning of what is now, I guess, about a 15-year, not quite, 14-year research program to understand why that is so. And when we were in the field, we realized, okay, well, they're telling us that drug traffickers are causing the deforestation. And I can get a lot of good ethnographic data on that here in the field, and we did. We talked to a lot of people, and they all told us the same thing, and they helped us to understand the processes that might be contributing to that, like laundering money and land and the brutal ways that traffickers were dispossessing indigenous people of their homelands. But I needed to get a better sense of how broad this process was and where else it was occurring. So I called colleagues who were working elsewhere in Central America, and they said, hey, yeah, we're getting the same ethnographic evidence on the ground, talking to people. They're telling us very similar things, especially in Guatemala and Eastern Nicaragua. And that was great, but we needed people who were capable of analyzing satellite imagery to help us identify a bigger pattern. Because it's one thing for people to say, yeah, the narcos are cutting down the forest, but if we wanted to make that claim, we really needed to show that this was happening on a scale that mattered. And I needed to find colleagues who had those skill sets. I needed to find colleagues in the land change science community who were familiar with working with, kind of messy tropical forest images and understanding how to analyze for change. And then we needed data about drug trafficking. And so how do you get data on drug trafficking? Who knows the most about drug trafficking? Well, the US government has an unbelievable infrastructure for tracking what cocaine traffickers do. Not all of it is declassified, but what is, I needed a lot of help getting those data. And so there is none of the insights from that work would have been possible outside of a team science model. Like no one person could have tackled that research question. I had a bunch of questions, but I needed a team to help me answer them. And then they came up with questions of their own. And Jennifer joined that team, I think in 2017 or 2018. And it was great to have her, another geographer, political ecologist with a lot of grounded experience in northern Guatemala. She joined a team that included some political economists from political science departments, anthropologists, land change scientists, spatial ecologists, and together we were all tackling this question of how, the question was how are narcos able to do this, and how is U.S. drug policy enabling that? And the reason we continue to work as a team, and it's been a long time now, and we're all in different stages of our careers and in different universities, what holds us together, I think, is we all have a commitment to the people of Central America who are facing these who are on the receiving end of these horrible processes, and we talk to them or WhatsApp them regularly, and I think that's what keeps us going. It's the human connections that keep us going. It's not the intellectual challenge of answering, these land change science questions, which are very real, but an intellectual question isn't necessarily what gets you up in the morning. What gets you up in the morning is knowing that someone you know well and have, care for in another country is suffering terribly because of things that your government is doing. That's what gets us out of bed in the morning.
Indeed, it's that human connection that facilitates, really, in many ways, that sense of commitment to keep this kind of research going. That really is, in a sense, an effort to ameliorate a kind of social injustice in some ways.
Yeah, well said. That's exactly right. I mean, a lot of people talk about the unintended consequences of the war on drugs as imagined and executed out of Washington, D.C. And they say that, in the U.S. government's sort of well-intentioned efforts to curb the scourge of drugs, I don't even know how to pronounce that. There are these sad unintended consequences, like people and nature are devastated in Central America. And I really repudiate that narrative. First of all, the war on drugs has never been well-intentioned. It's always been, since its earliest history in the prohibition movement of alcohol, it's always been about controlling Black, brown bodies and immigrants and the poor. And that's how it still functions in the United States, and that's how it functions overseas. And the reason the war on drugs continues in part because it is a way to control people in place, but it's also a way to benefit, for a small number of people to benefit from the tremendous profits that come from the trade in an illicit good. So I guess what I would say is, not only has it never been really a well-intentioned effort, the war on drugs, the consequences they may be unintentional, that could be true. I'm not sure they are, but they certainly are not unknown. If there are these consequences, our work has shown, and the work of many, many other scholars before us and now shows, that the consequences are so predictable, and they've been predictable for 50 years. And so part of our job is to continue to show the harms that the war on drugs is causing around the world, and to continuously remind people that drug prohibition is a political choice. And if that sounds kind of like, I'm advocating for something, it's because my research has led me to have strong feelings about it, because I've talked to a lot of people and done a lot of research on this topic.
Well, your views are evidence-based, and as well as perhaps your emotions. And when the two are intertwined, it's a wonderful thing to be able to pursue this particular theme in your research, because it's something that you have a passion for, and there are reasons that drive you in that direction.
Right.
Now, we have about a minute or two to go here, and I'm going to ask you to reflect upon your career and to think about advice you might wish to share with undergraduates interested in pursuing geography, or graduate students that are pursuing research in geography, and even colleagues. Do you have any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share? Any advice you'd like to give?
Well, I've been teaching undergrads in this professionalization course now for about 12 years. Mm-hmm. And I know from sort of tracking their outcomes and their successes and failures as they pivot from being undergrads to going out into the world. And I can tell you that if you pursue a degree in geography, and if you are excited about pursuing that career, I assure you that there are really interesting jobs out there. and that the outlook for people with geography degrees is really good. It's been good for a long time, and it will continue to be really good. And so when your parents say, geography, what's that? Can you get a job in that? Doesn't the world have enough geography teachers? Why would you study geography? You tell them that not only can you have really exciting careers in geography, but it turns out they pay pretty well. Our graduates are doing really well financially relative to graduates of other departments in our college. And they're all doing well, but some are doing better than others, and the geographers are among them. So rest assured that if you're a geographer, you're on the right path. And if you're not a geographer, check it out, because it's a great career option.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure there will be those students that will view or listen to this presentation and ponder ways in which they can continue on in geography or explore geography.
Cool. It can't hurt to explore.
Well, Kendra, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a great pleasure to interview you today. You have a wonderful story.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk with you.
It's great. All right. Well, this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.